So I've had lots of requests for tuning guides to the Volkswagen Polo, and not really surprising, it's an extremely popular car. So let's look at the best mods you can do for your Volkswagen Polo. We're going to focus on performance mods and handling mods. We're going to deal with the handling mods first of all, and we're just going to help you to take your Polo to the next level. And when it comes to performance mods for your Volkswagen Polo, there seems to be shed loads of options out there. So we're going to pick through them and just highlight some of the most significant power gains you can get for your Polo, taking into account the money that you spend and the amount of time it takes to carry out these mods. So the Polo started off way back in 1974. It's had a long production run, and with the association between Audi and Volkswagen as they formed the Volkswagen Audi group, there's a lot of engines and superb options that come out, with the Polo GTI being one of the standout models for most drivers. So that's really what everyone's aiming at. They want a car that is fun to drive. So how do you make your Polo fun to drive? Well, most of the Polo owners that come to our site and our forum have got a naturally aspirated engine. For a lot of them, it's their first car, it's their first car project. So there's a few little typical problems that tend to happen that we're going to flag up just to help you to avoid those issues. I've got a small favour to ask though, please drop us a like because it really helps us to get out there. And in the comments, let us know what you've done to your Polo, what mods you're planning, and what you'd like us to cover in future videos, just to make sure that I can pump out the content that is relevant to you, that answers your questions. So when it comes to tuning a Polo, it's quite a small, light car, which actually lends itself nicely to having a good handling car. The stock suspension on most of them through the ages leaves a little to be desired. The GTI model's got better suspension than most, so swapping out to those is certainly an option. But there's a whole aftermarket of suspension kits around, various coilovers and different spring design. Now, just to shatter a myth, don't go as low as you can and as hard as you can. Most people think that will improve the performance, but what tends to happen is the wheels will just skip over the road surface rather than gripping and bedding down. So you might be taking a corner and the car will bounce off the road, which dramatically reduces the grip and reduces the handling. If you had a perfectly smooth track surface, it's a different matter. You guarantee that there aren't those potholes and you can set your car up as low and the suspension as hard as possible. But on everyday roads, sometimes going just a little bit lower and a little bit softer makes a difference. But the real boost you get to your handling comes in the geometry of the suspension, whether the toe is set in or out, and getting the camber alignment correct. So most Polos don't allow very much adjustment. There are some various kits around that allow you to have a bigger range of adjustment, but just making sure it's set up correctly can go a long way to improving the handling on your Polo. And the bushings, they're the rubber mounts that they use to connect the suspension components to your Polo chassis. They absorb a lot of the vibration, but they do wear over time, and that causes the suspension to slop around and can really upset the handling and just make the car terrible in the corners. So if you've got an older car with a higher mileage, there's probably an issue there that needs addressing. So replacing those bushings makes a lot of sense. For a lot of models, particularly the newer Polo, there's a whole range of polyurethane bushings that you can fit. I wouldn't personally recommend the really hard ones. You can get different grades now. So the factory would have used a rubber one, which was relatively soft and really good at absorbing the bump, but it wasn't too soft. So there's certainly need for a compromise here between having really firm bushings and having super soft bushing, but it's something you can achieve now, and getting the right bushings on your Polo can actually do a lot to improve the stock handling. So within the Volkswagen Audi parts bin, you've got a lot of other options as well. Looking to the performance models and performance variants, you can get brake upgrades. We've mentioned the suspension swaps that you can do on a lot of models. Bear in mind though that different weights of engines and different types of car do often necessitate a different approach to the suspension setup and softness and hardness. So it's not always a case you can just go out and swap. But improving the braking is another priority for a lot of owners, and just swapping out for some slightly bigger discs. If you check the hub sizes, you may well find that your Polo has the same hub size as a certain generation of Audi A3, and there may have been a performance variant there with slightly larger brake discs. So swapping those in means that you can go to your local breakers yard and get a relatively cheap upgrade for your Polo and dramatically improve the handling. But don't go too big on the brakes. The amount of grip you get from the tyres is really the limiting factor. So if you've met or exceeded the limit of grip, adding larger and larger brake discs will do very little to improve the performance of your car. We've got to talk about alloy wheels as well, because a lot of owners have fitted the largest wheels they can, and they've had problems where they've lowered it a bit. The bigger wheels are actually starting to rub on the arches, and they report that the handling is certainly not as good. What's happened though is you've added unsprung weight to each corner of the car. The larger wheels are heavier, they've got a bigger mass, and they're rotating like little gyroscopes. So if they're too big and heavy, they can really upset the handling of the car, and it forces you to use super low profile tyres. And low profile tyres theoretically give you better performance in the dry and on track surfaces, but most drivers are not in the dry. In the UK here, we probably through winter spend 80 or 90% of our time driving through horrible wet roads, and they've got potholes and things. So low profile tyres are certainly not the performance option that you want for most roads in most areas and most regions. So we've dealt with the handling and we've dealt with the stopping power of the car. So let's think now about the engine and how we would improve that. So the first no-brainer is if you've got the turbo engine, and if you're aiming at 140, 150 brake horsepower, chances are that engine is going to come with a turbo anyway. A remap is definitely the option to go for. So a remap on a petrol or diesel engine will generally give you about 20 to 30% more power without even breaking a sweat. On the diesels, the annoying thing is you get more fuel economy from them. It makes them much more efficient. You've got to watch the map isn't too aggressive, because you can get a bit of smoke and it can cause havoc with your DPF filters and other components within the engine. So make sure whoever maps the car knows what they're doing. The best setup really is to get your car set up on a rolling road. That way they can take into account every little nuance of your personal engine. They're all different. They come out of the factory and they're not all built to exactly the same tolerances. No matter what manufacturers claim, there are variations. So some cars remap and you get more power. Others struggle to make as much power, but in most cases you will get substantially more power when you've remapped it. So it would be better though to get even more power out of it. So although a remap can add a lot of power, if you adjust the turbo itself and go with a hybrid turbo or a larger turbo unit, you really can max the power gain. Adding a fast road cam is probably one of the biggest mechanical mods that you can just drop into a naturally aspirated engine. You typically get about 10% more power. If you can't source a fast road cam for your model, there's companies out there that will regrind your stock profile and they'll give you a slightly more aggressive profile, but don't go too extreme. If the cam profile is too extreme, it's going to affect the idling and the tick over. You're basically putting all the power in the top end of the engine, and that's not great for everyday driving. So although it's a mod that adds a lot of power, it's probably not the best mod for everyday driving. Fitting individual throttle bodies can allow a bit more control over the air going into the engine. You can match it up more precisely. It is fiddly to do, but it can make a difference to the balance and power the engine makes, and it also helps reduce the restrictions that you would typically get in the intake. What about induction kits and air filters? Well, in reality, they don't add power. Very few Volkswagen Polos will make more power if you add an induction kit. You might get a couple of extra horsepower at the top end, but a lot of the induction kits are larger. The air, although it will flow more air, it's flowing the air more slowly, and that'll often be to the detriment of your car's performance. If you've tuned it, you've got a turbo model in particular, and maybe you've added 30% more power, then you're probably are looking at some kind of restriction in your stock factory intake and exhaust. So it would certainly be worth going out then and looking at higher flowing alternatives. I'm a big advocate of panel air filters. Performance panel air filters flow much better than the paper ones. They don't filter as well, so you've got to bear that in mind as well. There's a little bit of a downside, but it can help remove that restriction without going to all the inherent problems you might get from an induction kit with sucking warm air in from the engine bay. Now in the exhaust, the typical restriction in the flow is nearly always around the catalysts that take out all of the harmful output from the exhaust and turn it into something a little less toxic. So fitting a high flow sports catalyst, if it's legal to do so in your area, will certainly go a long way to removing that typical restriction in the system. But I have to note that if you take the cat out completely, you won't see much more power than you would if you got a sports cat. So there really is no point making your car illegal and having to sort out the engine complaining about the lack of a catalyst and getting it mapped and sorted out correctly. You may just as well fit a sports catalyst that flows much better. And get the best of both worlds. You've got a car that is street legal in pretty much every country, and you're not having to mess around with the ECU and with the engine setup too much because you've removed something that the ECU is expecting to be there. So I've seen a lot of Polo owners fitting an uprated fuel pressure regulator, which is a nice cheap quick fix to get those injectors squirting more fuel into the engine, but it's probably not an ideal mod. You really need to get the ECU adjusted to just make sure that it's running correctly. You don't just want to dump more fuel into an engine, it needs to have more air. So the more expensive mods that help you to make more power really is starting to take the engine apart and replace components within the engine, increasing the compression ratio, adding a turbocharger, adding a supercharger. But to do that you'd need to lower the compression ratio because most engines have a fairly high compression ratio to start with, and making sure the head is correctly ported allows the air to flow into each of the cylinders. Enlarging the valves, doing a 3 or 5 angle valve job can do a lot to lift the performance. But a little word of warning here, tuning a car you get a percentage power gain. So if your car is only making 60 horsepower to start with, you can spend quite a lot of money and you'll only get 10% more power, an extra 6 horsepower. So you have got to look at it and ask yourself, is it viable? Am I going to actually notice the difference in power? And for most Polo drivers, particularly with the smaller engine, I have to just say it's probably not worth the effort. I personally would focus on improving the handling and just have a car that's a lot more fun. So there's some pretty interesting engine swap projects going on the Volkswagen Polos. We've seen the 1.8T engine used quite a lot. In base form, this engine puts out about 150 brake horsepower. It can be tuned to 300, 350, so it gives phenomenal potential to a small car like the Polo. You will have a lot of traction issues though because the Polo is front wheel drive. So a decent power figure to aim for, maybe around the 200 horsepower mark, maybe a little bit more if you've gone to the effort of getting the differential replaced and getting a better quality diff in there. But engine swaps are quite expensive, but you do get a phenomenal return on the tuning that you've done, and they also usually give you a better base to tune, particularly if you've got a smaller engine to start with. So certainly look at that. Now I will also mention that in the Volkswagen Polo the gearbox was a bit of a soft area. So a lot of models, I think the Mark IV was particularly notorious for having gearbox issues and gearbox problems. You can do a lot to improve the performance or the perceived performance of the engine by fitting a closer ratio gearbox. So if you're at the point where your gearbox is going, it's starting to grind, certain gears aren't working very well, you may as well throw that gearbox over to a specialist that can strip it down and change the gear ratios, and that will dramatically improve the acceleration. If you've done some tuning to the engine, you can also match those ratios with where the power is now and get a much faster takeoff. The differential also makes a big difference to handling on these cars, and fitting a torsion or a torque sensing differential can just make sure that you get the power down, particularly in heavy cornering, in wet conditions, and it can really transform the way the Polo handles. If you've got the turbo Polo, the 1.8T, the newer 1.4Ts, anything really with the turbo, even the diesels, then a remap is your best option. If you remap it, you can generally get 20, 30, maybe even 40% more power from your stock engine, and that's a phenomenal way to increase power, and it's relatively low cost when you look at the cost of all the other mods that you've got. So I hope the Polo tuning guide has been useful to you. Subscribe if you haven't done so, and please drop us a like because that really helps us to get out there. If you explore our videos more closely, you'll notice we've done a lot of the Volkswagen Audi Group engines, and I'm going to be dropping more videos in there over coming months and weeks. So don't forget to stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.